Then they saw it. The pig pen was nearly underwater. The small wooden shelter inside the enclosure was still standing, but the lower part of the pen had turned into a swirling, muddy pool. The fence posts were half submerged, and the pigs, 6 of them, were stranded on a tiny patch of dry ground, pressed together in terror. One of the smaller ones, a young sow, had already fallen into the water. She flailed, kicking desperately, her snout barely above the surface. Chapter 1. Invisible Storm. It was a morning like any other in the small town of Dovecot, nestled between the hills and the vast farmland of the region. The sun had just risen, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet village, and the first signs of life began to stir. Birds chirped outside, the faint hum of nature's early rhythm filling the air. The scent of dew on the grass mixed with the earthy smell of freshly plowed fields. On the porch of a humble, cozy cottage, a retired couple, John and Emma, sat, sipping their tea and watching the world slowly come to life. The life they had built in Dovecot was simple yet fulfilling. After decades of city living, they had sought peace and tranquility in the countryside. Their small farm was a haven of sorts, a patch of land they lovingly tended to, surrounded by the laughter of animals and the quiet hum of daily chores. It was a life grounded in routine, feeding the pigs, milking the cows, cleaning out the chicken coop, and tending to the vegetable garden. Each day brought its own rhythm, a rhythm that John and Emma had come to cherish. John, a tall, wiry man with a face lined by time and the sun, was at the heart of everything. He had a steady hand and a calm presence, a natural leader who had seen it all: work on the docks, time in the military, and a life of odd jobs. His love for animals was profound, and it showed in the way he cared for each one of them. Emma, short and spry with silver hair tied in a neat bun, was the heart of their home. She had a knack for tending to the small things, the flowers in their garden, the chickens that pecked around the yard, and the small household chores that kept their home running smoothly. Her laughter was the melody of their life, a sound that made everything seem brighter. This morning, like every other, began with a soft conversation about the day ahead. "John," Emma said, looking out over the field, "the sky looks a bit heavy today, don't you think?" John squinted against the rising sun, his hand shielding his eyes. He nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. It does look a bit stormy. Might rain later, but it won't be anything we can't handle." He always had that quiet assurance, the kind that came from a lifetime of experience. Emma trusted him implicitly, knowing he'd always figure out a way to solve whatever challenges came their way. But something in her gut told her this storm was going to be different. The wind had started picking up, rustling the trees in the distance, and the dark clouds that gathered above them looked ominous. Still, it was early, and the morning was peaceful. Nothing suggested the chaos that was soon to unfold. As they finished their tea, John rose from his chair with a grunt, stretching his stiff joints. "Time to see to the animals, then," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "I'll feed the pigs and you can check the chickens. The cows should be all right for now." Emma gave him a gentle smile, watching him walk towards the barn. He had always been the one to handle the bigger chores, feeding the livestock, mucking out the stables, fixing fences when they needed it. She liked to take care of the finer details, making sure the vegetables were watered, the eggs were gathered, and the house was in order. They worked in tandem like 2 parts of a well-oiled machine. But today, as they moved about the property, something seemed off. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The birds had fallen silent, and even the cows, who usually grazed lazily in the field, were uneasy, standing in clusters and staring at the sky. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as she watched them. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. By late morning, the wind had picked up, and the first raindrops began to fall. At first, it was a light drizzle, but it quickly escalated into a torrential downpour, the kind that could soak through clothing in a matter of minutes. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was deafening, and the wind howled in the distance. It didn't take long before the ground started to soften, and soon enough, the entire yard was a muddy mess. Emma stood by the kitchen window, watching the rain cascade in sheets, the world outside blurring into a gray, wet haze. She had been busy with the house, but now a deep unease settled in her chest. Something wasn't right. She had seen storms before, but this one felt different. John, meanwhile, had been in the barn, struggling to keep the pigs calm as the storm raged on. The swine were agitated, stomping and snorting, as if they too sensed the growing tension in the air. John was just finishing up when he noticed that the floor of the barn was starting to look unusually damp. He paused, his brow furrowing, and then glanced at the door. Water was slowly creeping in from under the threshold. His heart skipped a beat. The rain was coming down hard, but it wasn't just rain. It was water from the nearby stream that had overflown its banks, rushing into the barnyard. The soil, already saturated from days of rainfall, was struggling to absorb the new volume of water. The ground was turning into a swamp, and the barn was starting to flood. "Emma," he called out, his voice rising over the sound of the rain. "Get over here." Quickly, Emma rushed outside, her heart pounding in her chest. When she saw the water creeping into the barn, she felt a wave of panic wash over her. "John!" she shouted, running toward him. "What's happening?" "We've got to get the pigs out," John said urgently, grabbing her arm. "The water's rising too fast. If we don't move them now, we could lose them." Emma's mind raced as she processed what he said. They couldn't afford to lose the pigs. She couldn't bear the thought of it. The animals were their livelihood, their family in many ways. They had raised those pigs from the time they were little, and they had come to love them like their own. John and Emma scrambled to move the pigs to higher ground, their steps quick and frantic as they navigated the rising water. But as they worked, the storm only grew fiercer. The water rose faster than they had anticipated, and before long, it was up to their ankles. The barn, once their sanctuary, was quickly becoming a dangerous trap. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the pigs, some of them struggling to stand in the deepening water, their cries of distress echoing in the air. John moved quickly, herding them out, but it was clear they weren't going to make it in time. A loud crack split the air. One of the wooden beams of the barn had given way under the weight of the water. The floor splintered, and the structure of the barn groaned as the flooding worsened. "John!" Emma cried, her voice shaking. "We need to get out. It's too dangerous." John hesitated for a moment, but he knew she was right. The barn wasn't going to hold much longer. "Get the pigs to the old shed," he said, his voice grim. "It's the only dry place left." As they moved the pigs to safety, the water rose higher, and the storm raged on. They barely made it to the shed before the barn collapsed behind them, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. It was a sound they would never forget. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, Emma and John stood in the old shed, watching the storm continue to ravage their property. The pigs, now safe for the moment, snorted in confusion, but they were alive. But as they caught their breath, they realized that the battle wasn't over. The storm was still raging, and the flooding was far from over. Their work had only just begun, and in the back of their minds, both John and Emma knew this storm was only the beginning of something much bigger. The world outside had turned dark, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. John turned to Emma, his face a mask of determination. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "We always do." But even as he said the words, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was going to change everything. The storm raged through the night, its fury unrelenting. John and Emma were soaked to the bone, their clothes heavy with rainwater, their shoes caked in mud. They had managed to move the pigs to the old shed, a small structure that had once stored hay but now served as a temporary refuge for their precious animals. The wind howled around them, shaking the walls of the shed as they hurriedly covered the pigs with tarps to shield them from the pouring rain. By dawn, the storm had shown no signs of easing. The rain continued to fall in sheets, and the yard outside had transformed into a sea of water. The once dry paths that John and Emma had walked countless times were now indistinguishable from the swampy fields that surrounded their farm. The water was creeping closer to the house, and the faint sound of distant thunder still echoed through the air. John stood in the doorway of the shed, his tired eyes scanning the flooded yard. The river that ran at the edge of their property had overflowed, flooding the fields and making their usually serene land look like a scene from a nightmare. There was nothing to do but wait and assess the damage. He had lived through storms before, but this one felt different. The water was rising faster than he had anticipated, and the task ahead seemed daunting. "John," Emma's voice broke through the howling wind. She stood behind him, her face pale with worry. "We can't just leave them in here. We need to check the barn, see how bad the damage is." John turned to look at her, his heart heavy. He knew she was right. They couldn't afford to neglect the rest of the farm, even if their focus had shifted to the pigs. But the barn was their livelihood, the place where they stored feed, tools, and their precious hay. If it was damaged beyond repair, they would face an even bigger challenge. Without it, they would have nowhere to keep their animals, nowhere to store supplies for the winter. "I know," John said, his voice low and strained. "We'll have to be careful, though. The ground's too soft, and the barn could collapse. But we'll need to check it." He pulled on his heavy boots, caked with mud, and motioned for Emma to follow. Together, they made their way out of the shed, the rain lashing against their faces, the wind biting at their exposed skin. Emma huddled close to him, her steps slow and deliberate as they waded through the thickening mud. The yard had become a treacherous landscape, with puddles and hidden dips in the ground threatening to trip them at every turn. The barn was barely visible through the sheets of rain, its structure standing stoically against the storm. But as they approached, John's heart sank. The once sturdy building seemed smaller somehow, as if it had been hunched over by the weight of the water. The foundation was already beginning to give way, and the edges of the walls were warped from the swelling moisture. "Do you think it's safe?" Emma asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. John paused, his brow furrowing as he took in the sight before him. The barn had always been their pride, built by his own hands and reinforced over the years with care and attention. But now it was a fragile thing, an old structure battling the elements. He knew they couldn't waste time. The animals in the barn needed to be moved before the entire thing collapsed. "We have to try," John said firmly, grabbing Emma's arm to steady her. "We'll get to the door first. Stay close." They made their way toward the barn's entrance, careful with each step. The water was knee-deep in some places, and it seemed to rise with every minute that passed. As they neared the door, John heard a loud cracking noise, a sickening sound, like the breaking of bones. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, and looked around. A section of the roof had caved in. The wooden beams, weakened by the relentless rain, had given way. Water poured through the hole, flooding the interior of the barn even more rapidly. "John!" Emma cried, her voice strained with panic. "The pigs! We have to get them out of here now." John's mind raced. He looked back at the shed where they had left the pigs and then at the barn. There was no time to waste. He knew that if they didn't act fast, the water would drown their animals, and the barn would collapse entirely, trapping them inside. His hand gripped Emma's tighter as he led her to the barn door, his eyes scanning the wreckage. "Get the pigs," he shouted. "I'll try to hold the door. You get them into the shed again." But quickly, Emma nodded without hesitation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Together, they had built a life here, a life that depended on their animals, their love for the land, and their devotion to one another. She trusted him. They both trusted each other, and in this moment, it was that trust that would guide them. Emma rushed into the barn, her boots sinking into the water as she made her way toward the pigs, who were huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. The barn was chaotic. Hay soaked through, water rising rapidly, and the frantic noise of animals in distress. Emma's heart broke for them, but she focused on getting them out, just as John had instructed. She worked quickly, trying to coax the pigs toward the door, but the water was making everything harder. The pigs were confused, their usual docile nature replaced by fear. It was as if they could sense the danger closing in on them, and they resisted, struggling to stay where they were. "Come on now," Emma muttered to herself, pulling at the nearest pig. "It's all right, we're getting out of here." Outside, John was struggling to keep the barn door from fully collapsing. The structure groaned under the pressure of the water, the floor sloshing as the walls buckled. He pushed with all his might, his muscles aching, but it was clear that the barn was no longer safe. The storm had done its damage. Just as Emma managed to coax the last of the pigs out of the barn, the door finally gave way with a loud crash. Water poured into the barn, surging in like a river. John and Emma barely made it out, the heavy, soaked animals in tow, as the barn collapsed behind them with a deafening roar. They stumbled to the shed, where they had already moved the pigs earlier, now more crucial than ever as a safe haven. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought the growing fear in her chest. The barn was gone, completely destroyed. John turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "We've got them out. That's all we could do for now." But Emma's gaze was distant. She was shaken, not just by the destruction of the barn, but by the sheer force of the storm. Something about the way the world felt, so fragile, so out of control, struck her deeply. The animals were safe for now, but what about the rest of the farm? The fields were flooded. The house, too, was at risk. "The house," she began, her voice trembling. "John, what if the house?" John didn't answer. He didn't have to. He knew. He could see it in her eyes. The storm wasn't over yet, and there was still much work to be done. The storm was relentless, and they were only beginning to realize just how much it would change their lives. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, as the rain continued to pour down, they stood together in the safety of the shed, watching the floodwaters rise around them. They had made it through the worst, but the question was, how much more could they endure? And would their home, this life they had worked so hard for, survive the storm? Chapter 3. Treading Water. The storm did not let up. The rain, relentless and unforgiving, continued to hammer down on the little farm as if nature itself had conspired to test the limits of John and Emma's resolve. The once vibrant fields were now submerged under a thick layer of brown water, and the gentle hills that had once provided shelter and warmth now felt far removed from the lives they had known. The world around them had turned into a violent, unrecognizable place. And yet, in the midst of it all, John and Emma stood firm, resolute. Inside the shed, the pigs had settled, huddled together for warmth and comfort in the dry corners. The old shed, once a forgotten relic from their earlier years, now served as their sanctuary. It smelled of old straw, the faint scent of hay still lingering in the damp air. Despite the chaos unfolding outside, Emma managed to calm the animals with quiet words and gentle hands, her heart aching for their fear. She stroked each pig's back, murmuring to them, her voice soothing and constant, like the rhythm of the earth beneath their feet. John stood near the door, his face furrowed with deep lines of concern. The rain had soaked him through, and his eyes were fixed on the flooded landscape beyond. He could hear the distant sound of the creek, which had once lazily trickled along the edge of their property, now transformed into a roaring torrent. The water had already claimed the lower fields, and it seemed to be creeping closer to the house. "We need to check the cows," John said quietly, his voice low, almost drowned by the sound of the storm. "Make sure they're all right." Emma didn't respond immediately. She continued to stroke the pigs, trying to reassure them as much as herself. It was hard to think clearly in the face of such a disaster. The barn was gone. The fields were flooded. There was no telling how much damage the house had sustained. But the cows, those were their livelihood, the foundation of their farm. Without them, without their milk, their lives would be turned upside down. With a heavy sigh, Emma rose to her feet and wiped her damp brow. She knew John was right. There was no time to waste. She gave one last look at the pigs, making sure they were comfortable, and followed John out into the rain. The wind had picked up, howling across the flooded land, and the cold cut through their clothing like a knife. The yard was nearly unrecognizable. The once neat garden was now a patchwork of waterlogged earth, and the small path that led to the cows' pasture had been completely submerged. Their trusty little tractor, which had always served them well in times of need, sat abandoned at the edge of the barnyard, its wheels half sunken in the mud. John glanced back at Emma, his brow furrowed in concern. "We'll need to get them out of the pasture," he said, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "If that creek overflows, we'll lose them. We have to move them to higher ground." Emma nodded, but deep down, she couldn't help the gnawing sense of dread. Everything had changed so quickly. The water was rising faster than they had anticipated. The creek that had once been a quiet companion to their daily lives was now a menacing force, swelling with every passing hour, threatening to consume their land. Together, they waded through the water, their boots sinking into the thick mud, every step a battle against the storm. The cows, who had always been gentle and predictable, were huddled at the far end of the pasture, their eyes wide and fearful. They seemed as unnerved as the rest of the farm's inhabitants, their heads low and their ears pinned back. "We'll have to move them slowly," John said, his voice calm, but Emma could see the anxiety in his eyes. "Don't rush them. If we spook them, they'll run, and we'll never catch them." Emma nodded and approached the cows cautiously, speaking softly, trying to keep them calm. She knew them well, had spent hours each day tending to them, milking them, feeding them. They were part of the rhythm of her life, just as John was. They had weathered seasons together, faced challenges, and now, in the wake of the storm, they were all she had. But the cows were scared, and the storm's ferocity was making it difficult to reassure them. The rain fell in torrents, and the wind pushed against them, making each movement feel like a struggle. John had reached the front of the herd, trying to guide them with gentle hands, but they refused to move. "We have to get them out now," Emma said, her voice tense. "The creek's right there. They'll be trapped if we don't hurry." John glanced over his shoulder, his jaw tight. He knew she was right, but the cows were acting unpredictable, their instincts telling them to stay put, to huddle together in the safety of what little ground was still dry. With a resigned sigh, John turned back to the cows. "All right, come on, girls," he muttered, his voice a steady command. "We need to move." He took a few steps forward and reached for the lead cow, guiding her with a firm but gentle hand. She hesitated for a moment, looking over her shoulder as if to make sure the others were following. Slowly but surely, she took a step forward. Emma joined him, her presence offering the reassurance the cows needed. Together, they coaxed the herd toward the higher ground, past the floodwaters that were threatening to engulf their pasture. As they moved, Emma's heart raced. She could hear the sound of the creek growing louder, the rush of water moving faster than ever. It was a race against time. Would they make it in time? Or would the creek claim the cows, just as it had already claimed the land? The cows were finally on solid ground, but the water was still rising, and they weren't safe yet. The pasture was all but lost, and it was only a matter of time before the floodwaters would consume it entirely. But they had made it through the first hurdle. The cows were safe for now. John wiped the rain from his brow and glanced at Emma, his face grim but resolute. "We've got them moved," he said, "but we can't stay here. We need to figure out what to do next." Emma looked at him, her eyes tired but determined. She knew what had to be done. "We need to make sure the house is all right," she said quietly. "And we need to start thinking about getting everything we can out of the barn. We can't let it all go." John nodded, but before they could take another step, the ground beneath them shook. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was something much worse. A loud, creaking sound echoed through the air, followed by a deep rumble. The earth beneath their feet trembled, and Emma's stomach dropped. She turned quickly to look behind her, toward the creek. And then she saw it. The dam that had held back the creek's waters, the dam that had been a steady presence for as long as they had lived on the farm, was giving way. The water surged forward, an unstoppable force, racing toward them. "Run!" John shouted, grabbing Emma's arm. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran through the rain, through the flood, hearts pounding in their chests. The dam had broken, and the floodwaters were now a tidal wave, crashing down upon everything they had worked for. This was no longer just a storm. This was survival, and there was no telling what would be left standing when it was over. Chapter 4. The Last Stand. The sound of rushing water was deafening, like 1,000 wild horses galloping toward them. John and Emma didn't hesitate. Their survival instincts kicked in, and they ran as fast as they could through the now waist-deep floodwaters. The storm, which had already torn their lives apart in so many ways, was far from done with them. The dam had given way. The creek, once a gentle stream that wound its way lazily around the farm, had become a roaring monster. The walls of the barn, weakened by the flooding, were collapsing under the sheer force of the surge. The creek, now a torrent, was pulling everything in its path. Branches, debris, and worst of all, their beloved animals, toward the broken dam. John, Emma, a voice called from behind them, frantic and filled with panic. Emma spun around, her heart lurching. Her eyes locked onto the silhouette of a figure struggling against the rising tide. It was Mark, the farmer who lived just up the road. His face was grim, his clothes drenched, but there was something else in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also urgency. "Mark!" John shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "Get to higher ground, now." "I can't," Mark yelled back, struggling to stay upright in the surge. "The horses, they're caught. I can't leave them." Without another word, John was already moving toward Mark, his boots sinking deep into the mud. Emma followed closely behind, her breath sharp and shallow, the cold water cutting through her like a knife. They had to help. They had no choice. Mark was a neighbor, a friend who had helped them with repairs, and who had always lent a hand during difficult times. And now he needed them. "Stay behind me," John called as he waded through the water toward Mark. The current was too strong, pushing against them like a living thing, but they pressed on, pushing through the mud and debris. "There," Mark shouted, pointing toward the barnyard. A large fence post had come loose from the barn's collapsed structure, and the horses were trapped in a small pocket of dry land behind it, their hooves scrambling in panic. The horses were beautiful, strong animals, but they were terrified and confused, unable to escape the rising tide. The sight of the horses, their eyes wide with fear, broke Emma's heart. They had always been the symbol of strength and freedom for the farm, their presence a quiet reminder of simpler days. Now they were helpless, stranded in the rising floodwaters. "We've got to move them," John said, his voice tense as he scanned the scene. The barn was gone, reduced to rubble, and the horses were stuck in the far corner of the yard. Their only escape was through the fence, but it was impossible to get to them without risking being swept away by the current. Emma's mind raced. There was only one way. She turned to John, her voice resolute. "We'll have to make a path for them. If we can push the debris away from the fence, maybe we can get them through." John nodded, but he didn't say anything. They didn't have time for words, only action. Together, they grabbed whatever they could. Broken pieces of wood, old planks from the barn, anything they could use to pry away the debris. They worked as quickly as they could, their hands trembling in the cold, their hearts racing. The floodwaters were still rising, the creek threatening to take everything with it. They could feel the pressure mounting. The horses, still panicking, were oblivious to their efforts. Their desperate eyes flicked toward the gate, but they remained trapped, unable to break free. Emma's heart ached for them, the weight of their helplessness almost unbearable. "Come on," John muttered, shoving a broken beam of wood aside. "We're almost there." Finally, after what seemed like hours, they had cleared enough space to open the gate. John stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and nodded at Mark. "Go," he shouted. Mark didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, calling to the horses in low, calming tones, coaxing them forward. The first horse stepped cautiously toward the open space, its hooves clattering against the wet ground. The others followed suit, one by one, until they were all standing in the open. But there was no time to celebrate their success. The floodwaters were inching ever closer, and they had no idea how much longer they had before the creek overran the fields entirely. "Get them to higher ground," John urged, motioning toward the hills beyond the pasture. "We'll hold the line here." Mark didn't argue. He spurred the horses into motion, urging them up the hill towards safety. But Emma stayed where she was, her eyes fixed on the dark, menacing waters that were threatening to swallow everything she held dear. "We're not done yet," she whispered to herself, as if saying the words aloud could give them strength. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The floodwaters had claimed the barn, but they weren't done. And neither were they. John came to her side, his expression grim. "We need to get to the house. It's too dangerous out here." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't risk losing the house too. If the floodwaters reached the foundation, there was a good chance the house would collapse. It was their last line of defense. The house was still a quarter of a mile away, but the floodwaters were rising so fast that even walking through the muddy yard was becoming dangerous. As they turned toward the house, John grabbed her hand, his grip firm and steady. "We'll make it," he said, more to himself than to her. "We just need to keep moving." The rain fell in sheets, blurring their vision, and the ground was slick beneath their feet. With each step, the water grew deeper, the current stronger. They were wading through what had once been their life, their farm, their home, everything they had worked for. And now it was slipping away piece by piece. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. By the time they reached the house, the water had already begun to lap at the front porch. The ground around them was soaked, the floodwaters creeping up the foundation with each passing minute. "We have to move everything inside," Emma said, her voice strained. She wasn't sure where they would put everything, but they had to try. John nodded, his face set with determination. "We'll start with the food, the tools, anything we can't replace." Together, they worked in a frenzy, dragging furniture, supplies, and anything they could carry into the house. The wind howled around them, the storm still furious, but there was no time for fear now. The house was their last refuge, and they had to protect it. They barely made it inside before the floodwaters reached the door, surging over the porch and flooding the yard. The sky was dark, as if night had descended too early, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Emma collapsed into a chair, her body heavy with exhaustion. She looked out the window, watching as the floodwaters continued to rise, knowing that the worst was yet to come. "We'll stay here," John said quietly, sitting beside her. "We've lost the barn and the fields, who knows what will happen next. But we still have each other, and we'll fight to the end." Emma nodded, her hand reaching for his. "We'll fight, together." And as the storm continued its relentless assault, they knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about surviving the flood. It was about surviving what came after, about rebuilding no matter how impossible that might seem. Chapter 5. Through the flood. The floodwaters had reached the porch. John and Emma sat inside their farmhouse, soaked to the bone, staring out the window as their world was swallowed by the rising tide. The wind continued to howl, rattling the old wooden walls, and the sound of the rain drumming against the roof was deafening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The barn was gone. The fields were lost. The animals they had saved were safe for now, but the damage was done. And still, the storm raged on. John wiped his muddy hands on his soaked overalls and took a deep breath. "We can't just sit here," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "If the water keeps rising, we need to be ready to move." Emma nodded, but the thought of leaving their home made her stomach turn. "Where would we even go?" she asked, looking at him. "Everything we have is here. We'll figure it out," John said. "We always do." Despite his words, Emma could see the exhaustion in his face, the deep lines of worry etched into his skin. He had always been their rock, always the one who carried them through the hard times. But even John had his limits. She reached for his hand and gave it a squeeze. "First things first," she said. "We need to make sure we have what we need in case we do have to leave." John nodded, and together they got to work, gathering what matters. Moving through the house, they packed a few bags with whatever essentials they could grab, some food, dry clothes, first aid supplies. Emma wrapped a few family photographs in cloth and tucked them into a small bag. "Not much we can do about the furniture," John muttered as he looked around the room. The wooden floorboards creaked under their weight, already damp from the humidity. Emma glanced at their old wooden rocking chair, the one she had sat in every morning while sipping tea, watching the sunrise over the fields. Would it still be there when this was over? Would anything? She shook the thought away and turned her attention back to the supplies. We should check on the animals again, she said. Make sure they're still safe. John hesitated for a second, looking out the window. It's dangerous out there. I know, Emma said, but I won't sleep unless I know they're okay. John sighed but nodded. All right, let's go. Into the storm. Stepping outside felt like stepping into another world. The rain was relentless, the wind pushing against them with every step. The ground was a swamp, thick mud sucking at their boots as they made their way toward the shed where the pigs were sheltering. The water had risen even higher since they last checked. Emma's heart pounded as she hurried toward the shed, praying that the makeshift barriers they had built were holding. John reached the door first, pushing it open with a grunt. The pigs were huddled together in the driest corner, their small eyes watching the storm with quiet fear. They're all right, John said, relief evident in his voice. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good, she whispered, stepping inside. The smell of damp straw filled her nose, mixed with the familiar scent of the animals. She knelt beside them, running her hands along their backs, feeling their warmth. They're scared, she murmured. We all are, John said, leaning against the doorframe. But they're safe. That's what matters. Emma nodded, standing up. Let's check on the cows next. The cows were in the highest pasture, where they had moved them earlier, but with the floodwaters rising so fast, there was no telling if it was still safe. The walk to the pasture was harder than before. The wind had picked up, the water swirling around their feet, slowing them down. Emma's breath came in quick bursts as they pushed forward. When they reached the fence line, her heart sank. The water had already crept into the pasture. The cows were still there, but they were standing in ankle-deep water, shifting uncomfortably. The fence that had once marked the boundary of their land was barely visible above the flood. They won't last here, John said grimly. Emma swallowed hard. What do we do? John scanned the area. We have to move them up the hill, he said. There's no other choice. Emma nodded, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The cows were already nervous, and trying to get them through the rising water would be a challenge. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and began calling to them, her voice calm and steady despite the storm. Come on, girls, she said gently. We're going somewhere safe. John clapped his hands, urging them forward. Slowly, hesitantly, the first cow took a step, then another. The others followed. It was slow, grueling work. The mud pulled at their hooves, and the rain made it difficult to see. But inch by inch, step by step, they made their way toward higher ground. By the time they reached the top of the hill, Emma was shaking from exhaustion. The cows were safe, but the farm below them was disappearing beneath the water. She turned to John, her chest heaving. What if it doesn't stop? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. John looked out over the flooded land, his expression unreadable. Then we start over, he said simply. Emma bit her lip, staring at the wreckage of their life below. Start over. She wasn't sure if she had the strength for that. But as she stood there, holding John's hand, watching the storm rage on, she realized something. They had already lost so much, but they still had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 6. When the waters recede, the storm had passed. John and Emma stood at the top of the hill, looking down at what remained of their farm. The once thriving land, green and full of life, was now a vast, muddy swamp. Pools of water stretched as far as the eye could see, reflecting the pale morning light. Their barn was gone. The fences were broken. The land they had nurtured for decades was unrecognizable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the rising sun. It looks worse than I imagined, she whispered. John nodded, rubbing his hand over his damp beard. But it's still here, he said, his voice steady. The land's still here. And so are we. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. The cows, huddled behind them, let out soft, uneasy sounds. They had made it through the night, but the rest of the animals still needed to be checked. John adjusted his cap. "Come on," he said. "Let's see what we've got left." The aftermath. The walk back down to the house was slow. The mud was thick, clinging to their boots, making each step a struggle. Emma's heart pounded as they approached the pig pen, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When they reached the shed, she let out a breath of relief. The pigs were alive, tired, wet, and huddled together, but alive. Emma knelt beside them, stroking their muddy coats. "You made it, my loves," she whispered. John leaned against the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's something," he murmured. "Let's check the rest." The geese and ducks had taken shelter near the chicken coop. Some of the coop had collapsed, but miraculously, most of the birds had survived. Emma shook her head in disbelief. "They're tougher than they look," she muttered. John smirked. "So are we." But the damage to the barn was undeniable. What hadn't been washed away had collapsed under the weight of the storm. The tools, the feed, everything inside, it was all gone. Emma's stomach twisted. "We won't have enough feed to last long," she murmured. John exhaled slowly. "We'll figure it out." They always did. The first steps to recovery. After a brief rest, they set to work. There was no time to mourn what was lost. The animals needed food. The fences needed fixing. And they had to salvage whatever they could. John spent the morning dragging broken boards from what remained of the barn, sorting through the wreckage. He managed to find a few tools, caked in mud but still usable. Emma, meanwhile, focused on the animals. She fetched fresh water, cleaned their muddy coats, and did her best to comfort them. She took extra time with the cows, running a damp cloth over their thick hides, speaking to them in soothing tones. "You were so brave," she murmured, scratching behind their ears. By midday, Mark arrived. He had lost part of his own farm to the flood, but he still came, bringing a truckload of extra feed and supplies. "You'd do the same for me," he said simply when Emma tried to protest. She squeezed his hand in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. As the sun climbed higher, John and Emma worked side by side, patching fences, clearing debris, and tending to the animals. The work was slow and exhausting, but they didn't stop. By sunset, they sat together on the front porch, watching the golden light stretch over the waterlogged land. Emma leaned her head against John's shoulder. "We lost a lot," she murmured. John took her hand in his. "But we didn't lose everything," he said. "We still have each other. We still have the farm." Emma closed her eyes, breathing in the fresh air, the scent of wet earth and hay. They had survived the storm. Now they would rebuild, and no matter how hard it was, they would do it together. Chapter 7. The Weight of Rebuilding. The morning sun rose over the battered land, casting long shadows over the fields still drenched in water. The air smelled of damp earth and broken wood, a reminder of what had been lost. John stretched his aching muscles, wincing as his back protested the previous day's work. Emma stood beside him, her arms crossed, surveying the damage with tired eyes. They had saved their animals, but the farm itself was barely holding together. "We have to start somewhere," Emma said softly. John nodded, rolling his shoulders. "Let's fix what we can," picking up the pieces. The barn was the biggest problem. Without it, they had nowhere safe to store what little feed remained. And if they didn't repair the fences, the animals could wander. John started with the fence, gathering what wood he could salvage. It was slow work. His hands, rough and calloused, worked with practiced precision, but the exhaustion in his bones made every movement feel heavier. Emma, meanwhile, tended to the animals, washing the mud from their coats and checking for injuries. She took extra care with the pigs, who were still shaken from the flood. "You gave us quite the scare," she murmured as she scrubbed mud from their thick hides. The pigs snorted, nudging her hands, as if understanding her words. She smiled despite herself, a helping hand. Midday brought another visitor, Marianne, their neighbor from up the road. She arrived with a basket of fresh bread, jars of preserves, and a warm smile. "I figured you could use something sweet after all this," she said, setting the basket on the kitchen table. Emma wiped her hands on her apron. "You didn't have to do that." Marian waved a hand. "Nonsense. We take care of our own." John entered the house just in time to hear her words, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you're offering help, we could use a few strong hands," he admitted. Marian grinned. "I'll send my boys over after lunch. They're good with a hammer." Relief flooded Emma's chest. They weren't alone in this. The first victory. By the afternoon, the farm was alive with movement. Marianne's sons, Paul and Henry, arrived with extra tools and eager energy. Together, they reinforced the fences, cleared away debris, and began laying the groundwork for rebuilding the barn. Emma focused on the smaller repairs, patching up the chicken coop, replacing lost feed with what little they had left. Every small act felt like progress, even if the road ahead was long. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John leaned against the fence, watching the animals settle in for the night. Emma came to stand beside him. "We're getting there," she said softly. John exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, we are." The farm was far from whole, but today had been a step forward. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 8. The breaking point. Days passed, and the land slowly dried under the sun's warmth. But the flood had left its scars, deep trenches of washed-out soil, broken beams from the barn, and the constant ache in John and Emma's tired bodies. The animals were safe, the fences were standing, and they had just enough feed to keep going. But the farm's biggest problem was still ahead. The old tractor, the one that had been John's reliable workhorse for years, hadn't started since the flood. Without it, they couldn't till the soil, haul heavy supplies, or repair the deeper damage left by the storm. And no matter how many times John tinkered with it, the engine refused to turn over. That morning, he stood beside the tractor, wiping grease off his hands, frustration tightening his jaw. "She's gone," he muttered. Emma watched him from the doorway of the barn, concern in her eyes. "Can we get her fixed?" John exhaled, shaking his head. "Not by myself, and not without parts." Emma knew what that meant. Repairs cost money. Money they didn't have. A desperate attempt. By midday, John had pulled out every tool he owned, determined to fix the tractor himself. He crawled underneath, tightening bolts, cleaning out mud, and checking wires. Hours passed. Sweat dripped down his back. The sun was high in the sky. Emma brought him water, but he barely noticed. He was a man at war with rust and time, unwilling to let go of something that had carried them through so many years. By late afternoon, he tried the ignition one last time. Click. Nothing. Click. Silence. John let out a frustrated growl, slamming the hood shut. "Damn thing's useless," he snapped. Emma flinched at his tone. It wasn't like John to lose his temper, but exhaustion was weighing on them both. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure something out," she said softly. John clenched his jaw. "I don't know how, Em. Without the tractor, we can't plant, we can't haul, we can't." He cut himself off, his voice rough with frustration. Emma looked at him, really looked at him. The lines on his face deeper than before, the weight of worry in his eyes. "We always find a way," she whispered, a glimmer of hope. That evening, just as the sky turned to shades of gold and pink, their phone rang. It was Mark. "Still fighting that old tractor?" he asked, his voice light but knowing. John sighed. "She's gone, Mark. Flood did her in." There was a pause on the other end. Then Mark cleared his throat. "I might have an idea. You and Emma swing by tomorrow morning." John frowned. "What kind of idea?" Mark only chuckled. "Just trust me." Emma, listening from the doorway, met John's gaze. For the first time in days, there was something in his eyes besides exhaustion. Hope. The road ahead. That night, as they sat on the porch, Emma rested her hand on John's. "Maybe Mark knows someone who can help." John exhaled, staring at the stars. Maybe. The farm still had a long way to go. The damage couldn't be undone overnight. But tomorrow there was a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. And sometimes that was all they needed. Chapter 9. An Unexpected Solution. The next morning, John and Emma set out early, driving down the familiar dirt road to Mark's farm. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the soaked fields. The scent of wet earth and morning dew filled the air. It should have been a peaceful ride, but tension sat heavy between them. John gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his mind still stuck on the tractor. He hated asking for help, even from a friend. Emma could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands fidgeted as he drove. "You're thinking too much again," she said gently. John let out a rough chuckle. "Hard not to, She reached over, giving his arm a squeeze. "Mark wouldn't have called us if he didn't have a real idea." John sighed, nodding, but he still didn't look convinced. A deal on the table. Mark was already outside when they arrived, leaning against an old pickup, a mug of coffee in his hand. His farm had taken damage too. Floodwaters had drowned half his fields, but he still wore his usual easygoing smile. "Morning," he called as John stepped out of the truck. "Hope you two are ready for some good news." John raised an eyebrow. "I'll believe it when I hear it." Mark laughed and gestured for them to follow him toward the barn. As they walked, he started explaining. "Remember my cousin Danny? The one over in Oak Ridge?" John nodded. He didn't know Danny well, but he'd heard Mark mention him before. "Well, turns out Danny just upgraded his tractor. He's got an old one sitting around. Older than yours, but still runs fine." Mark paused, then grinned. "He's willing to let it go for cheap. Way cheaper than any dealer would sell." John stopped walking. "How cheap?" Mark scratched his chin. "He said he'd take $500 for it." John let out a low whistle. Even a used tractor could go for thousands. 500 was a steal, but it was still $500 more than they had. Emma spoke first. "That's really generous of him." Mark shrugged. "Danny's got a soft spot for old farmers like us. Says he'd rather see it go to someone who needs it than let it rust in his barn." John crossed his arms. "It's a good deal, but money's tight." "I figured as much," Mark said, setting down his coffee. "That's why I was thinking. Maybe we work something out. Danny could use some extra help on his land. If you help him out for a bit, he'll knock the price down even more. Maybe even let it go for next to nothing." John hesitated. The thought of leaving his own farm, even for a few days, made his stomach twist. There was still so much work to do at home. But without a tractor, they wouldn't get anywhere. Emma touched his arm. "It might be our only choice." John exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right, let's go see this tractor." The test drive. Oak Ridge was a 2-hour drive, long enough for John's nerves to settle into something steadier. He wasn't sure what he expected when they arrived at Danny's farm, but the moment they pulled up, he spotted the tractor right away. It was old, maybe even older than his, but it looked solid. Faded green paint, a few dents and scratches, but the tires were good, and the engine didn't look half bad. Danny, a tall man with a friendly face, greeted them with a firm handshake. "Heard you're in need of some wheels." John nodded, eyeing the tractor. "That depends. She still run?" Danny grinned. "Only one way to find out." He climbed up, turned the key, and after a cough of black smoke, the engine rumbled to life. It wasn't perfect. John could hear the hesitation in the motor, but it was alive. Emma grinned. "Sounds better than ours already." John ran a hand over the metal frame, inspecting every inch. Finally, he looked up at Danny. "How much work you need done?" Danny laughed. "Oh, not much. Couple days labor, helping clear some downed trees, fixing up a few things. Nothing you can't handle." John glanced at Emma, who gave him an encouraging nod. "All right," he said. "You've got a deal. Hard work pays off." The next few days were exhausting. John worked from dawn until dusk, clearing storm debris, fixing fences, hauling supplies. His back ached, his hands were sore, but he pushed through, knowing what was waiting for him at the end. Emma stayed back at their farm, keeping things running. Every evening, they spoke on the phone, and even though John was tired, hearing her voice reminded him why he was doing this. By the 4th day, Danny handed him the keys. "She's yours," he said. Take good care of her. John ran his fingers over the worn metal and felt something he hadn't in weeks. Relief. Thanks, Danny. This means a lot. Danny just grinned. Don't mention it. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Don't let her drown like the last one. John laughed for the first time in days. Homecoming. When John finally pulled into the driveway, Emma was already outside, waiting. She clapped her hands together when she saw the tractor. Well, look at that, she said, grinning. You did it. John climbed down, stretching out his stiff legs. We did it. Emma wrapped her arms around him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. I missed you. John exhaled, holding her close. I missed you too, Em. He turned back to the tractor, pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't new. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And with it, they could finally start moving forward again. The storm had nearly taken everything from them, but they were still standing. And now, with a working tractor and a renewed sense of hope, they were ready to rebuild. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The morning sun stretched across the farm, bathing everything in soft golden light. The land, though still scarred from the storm, was slowly coming back to life. Birds chirped from the trees, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the rhythmic sounds of farm life had returned. The lowing of cows, the chatter of geese, and the occasional snort from the pigs. John stood beside his newly acquired tractor, running a hand along the worn metal. It wasn't new, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And, most importantly, it worked. Emma appeared beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. Well, she asked, tilting her head. John smirked. Let's see what she can do. Back to work. The moment the engine rumbled to life, John felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It had been weeks of struggle, storms, broken equipment, uncertainty. But now, finally, they had what they needed to move forward. With Emma watching from the porch, John took the tractor out to the fields. The tires rolled over the damp earth, leaving deep, sturdy tracks. The engine growled but didn't falter, and as John maneuvered the machine across the land, he allowed himself to believe, really believe, that they were going to be okay. The land still needed time to recover, but now they could till the soil, clear the debris, and prepare for planting season. The farm wasn't just surviving, it was coming back to life. A visit from friends. That afternoon, Mark and Marion stopped by, their truck loaded with supplies. Heard you got yourself a new set of wheels, Mark teased as he climbed out. John chuckled. Not exactly new, but she'll do the job. Marion handed Emma a basket filled with fresh bread and preserves. A little something for all your hard work, she said warmly. Emma smiled, touched by the kindness. You two spoil us. Mark waved a hand. That's what neighbors are for. They spent the afternoon working together, patching the last broken sections of the fence, checking on the animals, and sharing stories over cups of hot coffee. The farm still needed repairs, but for the first time in a long time, it felt whole again. The small joys. That evening, John and Emma sat on the porch, their hands wrapped around warm mugs of tea. The air was crisp but pleasant, carrying the scent of fresh hay and damp soil. Emma leaned her head on John's shoulder. It feels different, doesn't it? She murmured. John nodded. Yeah. Feels lighter. The storm had tried to take everything from them. Their home, their animals, their hope. But it had failed. They had weathered the worst of it, together, and now they were stronger for it. Emma let out a small laugh. Remember when we first moved here? You swore up and down that farming would be easy work. John groaned. Don't remind me. They fell into comfortable laughter, the kind that comes from shared years and countless struggles. It was true, the farm had never been easy, but it had always been worth it. As the stars blinked into the sky, Emma reached for John's hand, squeezing it gently. We made it, she whispered. John squeezed back. Yeah, we did. The farm still had scars. The land still needed work. But for now, in this quiet moment, all was well. And that was enough.